So Metroid Prime took gamers by surprise for how good it was, and it became one of the definitive reasons to own a GameCube. Because of the insane popularity for this game, Retro Studios was asked to make another one, and so, alongside Zero Mission, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes was released for the GameCube in November 2004. Good lord, this game has just turned 10 years old. I actually managed to get this particular copy all the way back in 2005 or 6, so I would have been around 10 or 11 years old at the time, and it was part of one of my biggest regrets I've ever made in my gaming career. You see, I only had enough money at the time to buy one of two games. One was Metroid Prime 2, and the other was Bionicle. Being the stupid kid that I was back then, I went with Bionicle and finished it the following morning. It was bad, like really bad. It was a tough lesson for me, but it taught me that you have to be careful with the kind of game you want to pick up and play. Because of my ludicrous decision, I had to wait until I got some more money and pick up Prime 2, and holy hell was it so much better. It's often seen as the darkest game in the series, but I think these people forget that Metroid has never really been a lighthearted franchise. This was my first time playing a Metroid Prime game, and back then I thought it was great. Saying that though, until now I hadn't completed this game since I first got it. My first of 3 recording sessions for this review was only the second time I made it through all the way to the end. I did play it again occasionally beforehand, but it had been years since I finished the main story. Was there a reason for this? I mean, I can still pick up and finish the first Prime game, no problem. But what was it about this game that didn't keep me coming back as much? Well, let's look at the story first. It's unclear as to how long it's been since the first Prime game, but Samus sets out to look for missing Galactic Federation troops near the planet Aether. I think that's how it's pronounced. Upon getting near Aether, however, violent lightning storms continuously hit Samus' ship, and yet it doesn't leave a scratch on the thing. I'm guessing the ship is made by the same materials used for the Batmobile. And looks like Queen Himiko's up to no good again. Now I can take Lara Croft getting this kind of bad luck, but you leave Samus alone, you witch. Walking through a bit into Aether, Samus manages to find some of the missing GF troops who are unfortunately dead, but not until a strange aura appears around them and causes them to rise. Zombies in a Metroid game. Let me tell you, if The Last of Us or Left 4 Dead had Samus involved, zombies would just be a thing of the past. Shortly after dealing with the revived troops, Samus finds and enters a portal that leads to a strange land, where she comes across a dark doppelganger of herself absorbing the dangerous chemical substance Phazon from the last game. Remember the creepy hand and eye that emerged out of the remains of Metroid Prime after defeating it? Well, now it's taken on the form of Samus and is given the clever title of Dark Samus. Think of it like the SAX in Metroid Fusion, only nowhere near as intimidating, but I'll get back to that later. Dark Samus calls upon a large group of small creatures who proceed to dogpile on Samus and somehow steal most of her upgrades before being pushed back through the portal. How the hell were they able to do that? I always assumed the upgrades became a part of Samus, as if it's programmed into her. Can it just be taken off at will? I wonder why other monsters haven't considered doing this. After traveling a bit longer, Samus learns that the GF troops were attacked by the same creatures that stole her equipment, and soon decides to enter a nearby temple where she comes across a mysterious being known as Umos, the last of an endangered alien race called the Luminoth, who used to fight against the dark creatures that Umos calls the Ing. Furthermore, like in Talon 4, he tells Samus that an asteroid once struck Aether and the Phazon caused it to split into 2 dimensions, an Aether filled with light and an Aether filled with darkness. Don't ask me how it works, let's just keep going. Umos then explains that the Ing have taken the source of Light Aether's energy that keeps the planet alive and begs her to get it back. As well as that though, 3 regions of Aether have also lost their energy, so in order for Samus to achieve her goals, she has to constantly travel and manipulate whatever happens in both Light and Dark Aether. Hey, wait a minute. Prime 2 is definitely a bit more story-driven than its predecessor, which I suppose that some people may not like, since they're forced to watch these cutscenes unfold instead of learning about the planet through scanning. But there aren't that many of them, and they're not overly long or anything, so I personally don't mind this approach. Besides, you can still scan stuff you come across to gather more information if you want to, which has gotten quite a nice upgrade because the objects are now covered in different colors instead of looking for orange or red squares, with blue and red ones to either progress further or put into the logbook. The controls for Prime 2 are exactly how they were in the first game, and they work just as well here as it did then. The main focus is still exploration, and you still need to get your upgrades back by defeating bosses and searching in specific rooms, but hell, I think we're used to that at this point. And as you'd suspect, Samus has some new toys to play with. First up are the new beam weapons, in the form of the Light Beam, the Dark Beam, and the Annihilator Beam you get very late in the game. Honestly, these aren't really the most innovative of beam weapons, as their only purpose is to take out enemies of the opposite dimension. The dark enemies are weak to the light enemies are weak to the dark beam, and the annihilator beam compensates for both and can home in on enemies at the cost of using both light and dark ammo. Yes, you heard me right, these new beam weapons have an ammo count. You can find expansions in certain spots that let you carry more, but the point is that ammo has always only been applied to missiles, and the beam weapons could be fired as many times as you wanted to. The only thing you needed to worry about was figuring out what type of beam weapons work best in your favor. But in Prime 2, you now also have to make sure that you don't run dry, which can be pretty uncomfortable. Not to mention that, like the last game, you can also get special abilities for each of the beam weapons, which not only cost a lot of light and dark ammo, but also use a lot of missiles. The dark beam has the dark burst, the light beam has the sunburst, and the annihilator beam has the sonic boom. No, not that one. Aside from that, the power-ups are essentially alterations of previously existing ones, like the X-ray and thermal visor turning into the dark and echo visor, where the former lets you see invisible objects and enemies in red, and the latter picks up sound waves to shoot at and solve specific puzzles. Then there's the Seeker launcher, which allows you to fire 5 missiles at once and get through certain doors, but I hardly ever use this in combat as it's a bit awkward to handle. Instead of a gravity suit to let us easily traverse through water, we're instead given the gravity boost that's attached to Samus's back and gives us the ability to briefly hover in the water. I quite like this new power-up, but the lower half of Torvus Bog is the only water-filled area in the game, so you won't be using it that often. But the upgrade that's gotten the biggest change is the 3D debut of the Screw Attack. Unfortunately, what was once one of the greatest power-ups in video game history has now been devoted to crossing large gaps and climbing up a type of wall. You can still kill enemies almost instantly if you run into them with it, but steering is extremely stiff. So sadly, using the Screw Attack is a very impractical way of attacking, and that pains me to say that. Moving on from the upgrades, the only major addition to the gameplay is the ability to travel between dimensions. In various locations, you can access a portal that goes between light and dark aether. And like in A Link to the Past, you need to make changes in one world to affect another if you want to progress. Dark Aether structure is almost exactly the same as Light Aethers, but the layout for each room is a bit different. As you'd expect, it's also a lot more bleak than Light Aether, and in addition, the air is incredibly poisonous, so you need to constantly move quickly and surround yourself in light beacons that slowly refill your health. And let me tell you, there is nothing more boring in a Metroid game than having to wait very patiently for your health to be at a certain rate in order to get further. You do acquire the Dark Suit fairly early on, however, which doesn't let you take quite as much damage in the Dark World. And near the end of the game, you get the Light Suit, which looks a bit silly, but it protects you completely from Dark Aether's atmosphere. By the way, I hope you like the look of the Dark Suit, because you'll be using it for about 70% of the game. Now, I don't mind the concept of traveling between light and dark worlds, but I'm not really a fan of Dark Aether as a whole. Running blindly through its poisonous air is both stressful and annoying, especially since save points are a bit stingy in this game, and the lighting is so dark that I frequently lose my way. Oh, so that's what people meant by the darkest game in the series. Dark Aether is not the only thing that isn't visually appealing. All of the areas, with maybe the exception of the Sanctuary Fortress, just look kinda bland. It's a lot of the same stuff that we've seen before with very little changes to it. The Temple Grounds is your basic ancient ruins area, the Aegon Waste is a generic desolate desert, and Torvus Bog is your typical water-filled forest. It's a breath of fresh air when you get to the Sanctuary Fortress, but even this area can drag after a while. The graphics are just about as good as they were in Prime 1, but the environments don't have the same spark, and particularly when traveling through Dark Aether, I feel a tad bit drowsy just looking at them. The music isn't much better either. In fact, I don't think there are as many tracks as last time, and the ones that are there are incredibly forgettable. The only song in the game that I find myself humming to is the title screen music, which is sad because Metroid is a franchise that has had some really great tunes over the years. I will say, however, that the Space Pirate music is a lot better than before, but mainly because there's no squealing from them this time. God damn, that got annoying. But where I think Prime 2 suffers the most is the constant backtracking. Yeah, I know Metroid games have always been about backtracking, but the way it's laid out in this game is utterly ridiculous. There are a lot of moments where you're just basically getting an upgrade, backtracking to a previously visited area to use that upgrade to get another upgrade / gain access to a portal. I find myself having to wait for the hint system to kick in more times than necessary because the objectives aren't always obvious. You sometimes have to go back to other regions to either talk to Umos or locate another upgrade, but nothing in the game makes that clear. I'm frequently exploring new areas I haven't explored before, only to find out that I've been going several miles in the opposite direction. However, the backtracking does not get any worse than in the Dark World. As Umos said in the beginning, you need to get back the energy from the dark versions of the 3 different areas. But in order to do that, you need to locate 3 specific keys that are hidden in specific locations. Sometimes they're fairly obvious to find, but other times they can be ridiculously well hidden. After getting the 3 keys, you then need to fight that region's boss to get another upgrade and get to the energy controller. Speaking of the bosses, there are definitely a lot more than there were in the first Prime game, and many of them actually remind me of the bosses from Metroid Fusion, since most of them are using Samus's abilities against her. A majority of the bosses aren't too difficult to defeat, but a few of them can seriously overstay their welcome. I cannot for the life of me stand the battles against the Boost and Spider Guardians. The Boost Guardian because he moves extremely quickly and hits like a tank, while beating the Spider Guardian just comes down to careful timing and awkward platforming in Morph Ball form. You have no idea how many times I've lost to the Boost Guardian on my first 2 playthroughs, which eventually caused me to rage quit. And as for the Spider Guardian, before you even get to him, you've already done a ton of exploration with no sign of a save station. If at any point you die during the battle against him, you would have to do that exploration all over again, which has happened to me on one occasion, and let's just say I died a little inside that day. There's a very similar problem before this in Torva's Bog, where you need to flick all sorts of switches before obtaining the gravity boost and fighting the Alpha Block all in one go. This guy's a pain in the ass to fight too, because the sidestep dash only works 50% of the time, and just before the end of the battle, he never seems to open his mouth for me to properly damage him. And then there are the gigantic bosses you need to fight after collecting the 3 keys for each area. These ones will without a doubt take the longest amount of time to defeat, either because it takes forever to land a blow on them, I'm looking at you Amorbus, or in all cases they'll have way too much health, I'm looking at you Chica. Quadraxis is definitely the most entertaining of these boss battles because he has a lot of different phases that are each quite brief. Now I wouldn't claim this to be one of the greatest boss battles in the series or anything, but this is what I call an epic 3D Metroid boss fight. I think as well as this though, the only other battles I fairly enjoy are the 3 boss fights against Dark Samus. Your thumb will probably hurt after a while from pressing the shoot button so many times, but it's nothing totally aggravating. Surprisingly, there's no Ridley or Meta Ridley in this game. That's a first since Metroid 2. And there's still no Kraid either, what gives? I understand if you couldn't add him in Prime 1 because of time constraints, but what's this game's excuse? Oh well. It's not just some of the bosses that can be annoying, there are a couple of enemies that can really screw you over if you're not prepared. My most hated enemies in the game are the Grenslers because they're difficult to hit, are complete bullet sponges, and never stay freaking still, and also the Dark Commandos. Ugh. Remember the irritating as all hell Chozo ghost that would keep disappearing and take forever to kill? Well, now we have the Dark Commandos to despise even more. Oh god, do I hate these guys. Like with the Chozo ghosts, it's incredibly difficult to keep track of where they are until you get the Dark Visor. And unlike the ghosts where you could just leave the room if you wanted to, the Dark Commandos lock all of the doors until you either defeat them or they run away because they're bored of fighting you, which takes a while. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get to the most tedious part of the game, the hunt for the Sky Temple keys. These are exactly like the Chozo artifacts from Prime 1, only this time you have to use the Dark Visor to locate these specific enemies in Dark Aether, blast them away, and then you'll find the key inside. You can still scan for hints of their whereabouts like in the first Prime game, but they're nowhere near as clear as before. So most of the time I'm just running blindly through Dark Aether with the Dark Visor on, hoping for the best. There are only 9 keys to collect this time, but the bottom line here is that there's already more than enough backtracking as it is, and this is the nail that seals the freaking coffin. Well anyway, after obtaining all the Sky Temple keys, we can access the final area, which contains only a giant room holding the big baddie of the game with the last of Aether's energy, the Emperor Ing, who like Quadraxis has different forms and takes a lot of abuse, but at the same time is pretty enjoyable to fight. The Emperor Ing is destroyed, and now we have to escape before time runs out. Woohoo, yes, we're blowing up the planet again, but why is the countdown giving me so much time? Well, rather coincidentally, this gives a creepy looking Dark Samus enough time to challenge you once more before Dark Aether blows up. I quite like this remix of the escape music from the original Metroid. It suits the battle pretty well, despite it not being terribly difficult. Dark Samus scatters into a million particles, Samus gets out of Dark Aether before it disappears, it doesn't blow up, and it turns out that the Luminoth weren't dead but in a frozen state and have now awakened. Samus gives the Luminoth a badass farewell and returns to her repaired gunship. But since I'm assuming it's hard to sit down with armor on, she decides to change into her Zero Suit if you scan enough objects in the game. Samus leaves Planet Aether, but if you've collected all the items of the game, you'll get an extra cutscene showing that Dark Samus isn't completely dead yet.
Foreshadow? Ah, who cares?
That may be the end of the single player campaign, but if that wasn't enough for you, then you have the option of playing multiplayer with friends. And it's pretty bare bones. This is the first time we've had multiplayer action in a Metroid game, and it certainly shows with its simplicity. There are only 2 game modes to choose from, your basic deathmatch and coin battles ripped right out of Smash Brothers for some reason. The maps are kind of boring and not that exciting to play around in, and some of the power-ups you can collect are tremendously overpowered, making it unfair for the other players. I suppose that this is good for a distraction, but there are far better multiplayer shooters to play, like the Metroid Blast game from Nintendo Land. Now that's fun. So Prime 2 is a good game, but it is by no means superior to its predecessor. Both versions of Aether are not as fun or as pretty looking as Talon 4 was, and while it's good that Retro Studios asked for advice from the Link to the Past producers on the whole Light World Dark World concept, I don't think it was quite as well implemented here. I mean, it does do a good job at first to make you feel uncomfortable, but once you've seen one dark area, you've pretty much seen it all. That, and it doesn't help that I sometimes can't see what I'm doing in these parts. Aside from that though, Retro Studios also wanted to make this game more difficult than Prime 1, but it ends up being more frustrating than hard. Having bosses move way too quickly while dealing a lot of damage and absorbing a lot of damage, in addition to some of them being placed far away from save points, is not what I would call good design. I'll say that Dark Samus is a pretty cool villain, but I wouldn't go as far as describing it threatening. The SAX infusion had all of your equipment, and because you were tremendously underpowered, you could do nothing but run away from it. This made every encounter with the SAX terrifying, and those slow, loud footsteps brought it on home. Since you battle against Dark Samus a bit more frequently than the SAX, and it's just as powerful as you are, there isn't quite as much tension to build up. Prime 2 overall does at least try to be different from the first game, and while some aspects of it may not work, it doesn't drag the game down enough to make it bad. In general though, it can be a bit dull at times, which is depressing for me to say about a Metroid title. I'd advise listening to some music or podcasts or something to keep you from getting worn out. Which, by the way, I'd recommend trying out some Kane and Rince podcasts. These guys do some good stuff. Can I suggest that you try this game out? Well, yes, it can occasionally be fun, but I wouldn't put this too high on the list of Metroid games you should play first. But at the very least, it'll give you a good idea of what to expect in 2007's Metroid Prime 3 Corruption for the Wii, the final chapter of the Prime Trilogy, excluding 2 spin-off titles. God damn, has it almost been 8 years already since this came out? 6 months after the events of Prime 2, the plot begins with Samus having a nightmare of Dark Samus' return before she is requested to turn up to a meeting between the Galactic Federation and 3 other bounty hunters. A giant robot named Gort, a shapeshifter named Gandrada, and an ice surfer named Rundus, who is probably the most memorable of the bounty hunters because he has the most interaction with Samus. Yeah, I know I'm jumping the gun a bit, but these guys do not have any sort of character development added to them whatsoever. They're barely given any screen time, and I couldn't care less about their motives, especially after a certain event plays out not too far into the game, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Samus arrives at the meeting with the other bounty hunters and Admiral Dane, where he gives them their mission of wiping out computer viruses from several organic computers called Aurora units spread across the galaxy. These are essentially what Mother Brain was, so yeah, you can see how wrong this could potentially go. Why do they still have these online? Did they not learn their lesson from the first game that having sentient brains with computer access is a bad idea? Is the Galactic Federation so ignorant that they would rather have a bunch of killer Mother Brains gather information for them and risk being slaughtered by them? Is that why she makes a return in Super Metroid and becomes a giant chicken? Okay, well, to be fair, the Aurora units in this game are pretty tame, but that's still a rather risky decision. Anyway, the meeting then gets rudely interrupted by space pirates, so Samus has to battle her way through and fly her ship to the planet Norian, where more space pirates are attacking the GF fleet. Suddenly Meta Ridley! Yeah, I'm guessing either the space pirates found him back in Talon 4, or he must have a self-repair function. So after fighting him again, Samus learns that the Phazon asteroids that have been dropping on all these planets in her adventures are called Leviathan Seeds, and that one is about to collide into Norian. The bounty hunters try to activate the base's defense system, but are suddenly ambushed by a revitalized Dark Samus, who manages to knock them all out, including Samus, but just before she succeeds in activating the defense system, destroying the oncoming Leviathan Seed. Cut to 1 month later, Samus awakens in a GF ship where she's told that Dark Samus' Phazon attacks have corrupted her. However, the Galactic Federation have equipped her and the other hunters with a Phazon enhancement device so that she can control the Phazon within her and give her healing properties upon stepping into a puddle of it. So this here is the new PED suit. You don't like the look? Well, too bad, because this is all you're gonna get in this game. Whatever your opinions are on the suit, it does its job well and lets you no longer worry about getting hurt by Phazon. Funny how one of the most dangerous substances in the last two games that caused all the problems we face so far is now suddenly medicine for Samus. It turns out that 3 other planets have been struck with Leviathan seeds as well, and the other bounty hunters have gone missing while trying to get rid of them. Despite being a month since Samus was in a coma, she's still able to walk just fine and is given the task to look for the missing bounty hunters and destroy the Leviathan seeds. Metroid Prime 3 plays almost exactly like the other Prime games, but there are a few things that have been changed a bit. The graphics have obviously gotten a boost and has much needed widescreen support, but the most notable difference would probably be the controls. You can still lock onto objects and enemies, but this time you need to use the Wiimote to aim Samus's gun and rotate her. So that means we can now easily strafe and make precise shots while you're moving. It's a very little change, but it makes a huge impact on the overall gameplay. You can alter the controls so that it's a little more like it was in Prime 1 and 2, but as much as I adore the GameCube controller, this control scheme feels so much smoother to move and shoot than before. The only issue that I have with it is that scanning small objects can be a pain, because 9 times out of 10 the cursor will scan the object next to it, and then by the time you start scanning the small object, it's too late. This is especially noticeable with enemies like Shriek Bats who move way too quickly for you to keep up. And there is so much to scan in this game, but thankfully the logbook does tell you how much there is to scan for each location, which is something I would have really liked in the last 2 games. Speaking of scanning though, whenever you scan stuff, defeat a boss, or perform a certain task, you're given a color credit that you can use at the gallery to buy bonuses, like concept art, music, a screenshot tool, and bumper stickers for your ship, as well as a bobblehead of your Mii to place on the dashboard. I would show you those last 3, but you stupidly have to send these so-called friend vouchers to other people who own the game and get a green credit in return, which means I need to grab some friend codes that most likely nobody uses anymore. Making us exchange friend codes for so many Wii games was an idiotic decision by Nintendo back then, and it still is now. The progression for Prime 3 plays very similarly to Metroid Fusion or Zero Mission. You're always told exactly where to go, but the way to getting there isn't entirely clear without becoming overly complicated or simplified. You can turn the hints off if you want to, but the game's overall the most linear of the Prime Trilogy. But like with Fusion and Zero Mission, it's a very good way to introduce newcomers to the series. Why they would go for the 3rd game in the series is beyond me. Well, to be fair, I wouldn't say that you necessarily have to play the other Prime games in order to understand the story for Corruption. Prime 2 maybe if you want to know Dark Samus a little better, but you generally don't need to play any of the other Metroid games to enjoy Prime 3.
Now I know that some people may prefer the branching pathways, allowing you to explore freely, but it could be worse. It could stop you from exploring altogether and take away everything that made the Metroid series so great, keeping you on a straight path at all times with no way of going back to the previous rooms. It's alright, Josh. Calm down. We're not at that game yet. Let's just cross that bridge when we get there.
So where was I? Oh yes, the progression. Traveling between rooms can either involve solving a simple puzzle, or in plenty of occasions, clearing a room full of enemies to progress. This brings me to the main gimmick of the game known as Hyper Mode. Remember back in the final battle against Metroid Prime when the Phazon suit allowed us to enter Hyper Mode by standing in purified Phazon? That's precisely what Hyper Mode does here, but Samus's inner Phazon allows us to access it at all times for 25 seconds at the cost of a full energy tank. And later on in the game, you'll get the Hyper Missiles, the Hyper Ball, and the Hyper Grapple to give or take away Phazon from enemies, just in case if this mode wasn't game-breaking enough. Like in Prime 1, when Samus enters Hyper Mode, her attack power increases tremendously, killing some enemies with as little as 3 or 4 hits, or sometimes even 1. And since health pickups often drop from enemies, that means you could possibly use Hyper Mode again and again without losing too much health. Samus can also become overloaded with Phazon if she gets hit too many times while in this state, where you have to shoot out all the Phazon in her before it corrupts her and turns her into Dark Samus, causing a game over. All this really does though is allow you more time to use Hyper Mode, just as long as you don't let that bar fill up all the way. You can always choose not to use Hyper Mode if you want more of a challenge, but it's still best to use these against some enemies that have a Hyper Mode of their own, because taking them out normally is an absolute chore. They have so much health that can hit really hard, so you have almost no choice but to enter Hyper Mode yourself anyway. Hyper Mode in general makes Prime 3 the easiest game in the trilogy, and probably one of the easiest Metroid games in existence. Thankfully, you can change the difficulty to how you like it, and just like the last 2 games, you'll unlock an even harder difficulty after you finish the game, so at least there's that. It's not all about running and gunning, however. Platforming makes an appearance once again, as well as a number of upgrades to collect, because I'm guessing when Samus caused Dark Aether to disappear, the light suit and the collectibles went with it. All of the power-ups from the past two Prime games are here once more, with only a few new ones unfortunately, and oddly having mostly to do with the grapple beam. I've already mentioned the Hyper Grapple you get pretty late in the game, but there's also the Grapple Lasso, which lets you pull certain objects to open new pathways and can even take away enemy shields. And then there's the Grapple Voltage that uses health to drain or charge terminals and even enemies. Returning from Metroid Fusion is the Ice Missiles, acting just as it did before. And sadly, as I said earlier, there aren't any suit upgrades to collect, so the closest thing there is the Hazard Shield, which protects you from the Space Pirate Homeworld's acid rain and allows you to easily swim through fuel gel pools. As for the beam weapons, unlike the other two Prime games, Corruption decides to keep it simple and let the beams stack up on one another instead of being separate weapons. There are only two to get this time, but making a comeback is the Plasma Beam that once again has heat properties and can now repair damaged circuit panels. And finally there's the Nova Beam that damages anything that has phasite attached to them, and this combined with the returning X-ray visor makes some mini-bosses no threat whatsoever. It's incredibly satisfying though, especially on Metroid hatchers who are a huge pain to deal with beforehand. Samus can also now use her rather ugly ship to clear out certain obstacles or carry a heavy object to her next destination. You can also tell it to shoot a lot of missiles in a certain spot, but I rarely use this. It's honestly not as cool as you'd think. Despite being able to collect a numerous amount of missiles for the gunship, there aren't that many areas in which you can actually use it. It's a shame too, because having the ship to swoop in and destroy enemies is rather gratifying, but in the end it's not really worth using, largely thanks to the alternate method of using Hyper Mode. The upgrades overall are just about as good as they've ever been, and it's very useful that if you activate bomb slots in the Chozo Observatory in Elysia, you can reveal the locations of every single item pickup in the game, except in the GFS Valhalla. Now, I suppose the only problems that I have with Prime 3 is that since the gameplay is a little more linear than the previous games and that a lot of ways of progressing further is shooting your way through, it can feel a little repetitive at times, particularly when you also have to use your ship to help you with your objective. I wouldn't go as far as saying that it's best played in short bursts like in Ape Escape and the Donkey Kong handheld games, but at times it can be a tad bit draining. I mentioned earlier how the other bounty hunters don't have much character development towards them, and clearly Retro Studios doesn't see that because they try and make you feel reluctant to kill them when you see that they've each been possessed by Dark Samus. Samus herself doesn't seem to have much problem fighting them either. She doesn't struggle to lift her arm cannon up or anything, she's just like, meh, whatever, die space freak! Oh, well, she does one time clench her fist after killing Gandrada, but I'm sorry, that doesn't do much for me. Finally, and this is a bit of a minor issue, but like a lot of Wii games that came out early in the console's life cycle, it loves to shoehorn in highly mundane motion gimmicks for no valid reason other than to show off the basics of what the Wii can do.
Exciting twisting! Outstanding pulling! Amazing button pressing!
I do like the inclusion of the spring ball, however, from the 2D games that you can use by flicking the Wiimote upwards. I find it much easier to jump with it than I do with bombs. The bosses are also just as big and threatening as they were before, but again, thanks to Hyper Mode, a lot of them are pretty damn easy. Huh, look at that, we get to fight Ridley twice in this game. I'm guessing he's making up for his disappearance in Prime 2. And yet there's still no Kraid. So eventually in your travels, the Galactic Federation managed to locate Dark Samus and the source of all Phazon in the galaxy, the planet Phase. Very clever name. Was this planet always in front of us this whole time and somehow Samus and the GF kept missing it? Sir, are you sure we're not missing anything that could lead us to the cause of our problems?
No, Private, I'm certain that there's nothing to help us.
Well, perhaps if you just turned your head to the right, sir?
Are you making a mockery of me, Private?
No, sir, I just think that if we took a good look around us, we might, just might be able to find something. Son, if there's one thing I've learned over the years is that you always have to look dead straight ahead at your enemy and not break eye contact whatsoever, even if there's something very important happening right next to you. I question your leadership, sir. Anyway, Samus and the others can only access Phase via wormhole, but the only way to activate it is by putting in secret codes that can be found on an abandoned GF ship called the GFS Valhalla. But when you get there, the power is totally dead, so that means Samus needs to find and use energy cells around the galaxy to turn on the power again and obtain the codes.
Sound familiar to you?
Uh-huh, the energy cells are this game's Chozo artifacts and Sky Temple keys. There are 9 in total. However, you don't need all the energy cells to gain access to the codes, you only need 5. The rest of the energy cells are just used to collect any item pickups you find in the Valhalla. And unlike Prime 1 and 2, you come across a majority of the energy cells before you get to this part, and by the time you do, you should have more than enough to reach the codes. Yes, thank you! After accessing the codes, everybody heads into the wormhole with Samus entering Phase while the Galactic Federation fend off against the remaining space pirates. Stepping into Phase, however, causes Samus to become permanently overloaded with Phazon. So that means we only have a limited amount of time to reach Dark Samus before being corrupted by Phazon and turn into another Dark Samus. Although since nothing's going to stop us coming out of Hyper Mode, Planet Phase won't take you very long to get through. You may come across an odd puzzle or two, but for the most part, traveling in this place isn't terribly challenging. Eventually, Samus meets with her Dark Doppelganger and the two of them battle to the death, which while more upbeat and energetic is not a very difficult fight at all. I'll say that the build up to Dark Samus is definitely better than the last game at least, since we don't encounter it multiple times. After wearing down Dark Samus, it proceeds with its other plan to use an angry, corrupted Aurora unit. Kind of a shame to think that to this day, this is the closest we'll ever get to a 3D Mother Brain battle. Like Dark Samus, the Aurora unit, albeit intimidating and carrying two forms, is not a hard final boss. Once again, thanks to the permanent Hyper Mode. In fact, I think it's even easier than Dark Samus. How do you do that? It's a tad bit disappointing since this is supposed to be the climactic battle to end the Prime Trilogy. So okay then, the Aurora unit is destroyed along with Dark Samus for the last time. Samus escapes Phase despite us not racing against the clock, and it explodes into many pieces, ridding of all Phazon left in the galaxy. See, we get to blow up a planet after all. Samus sends her regards to the Galactic Federation, and this is where the Prime Trilogy draws to a close. The secret endings this time, when you scan most of the objects and obtain all the items, involve Samus taking a moment to remember the deceased bounty hunters. Too bad I don't care about them. And while Samus is flying away in her ship, another unidentified ship is suspiciously following her. Will we ever find out who this mysterious person is? Who knows? Both Retro Studios and Nintendo have yet to make another Metroid game to continue this story. As the final game of the Prime series, I can definitely say that Prime 3 is fun to play for both fans and veterans of the Metroid franchise, as well as newcomers who are just looking for a good action-adventure game on the Wii. Though with the Wii U out now, I doubt that'll be many people. The motion controls for the most part work really well and certainly make it easier to defeat your foes, and while the game may feel repetitive at times, unlike Prime 2, it never gets boring. Some people may find the addition of Hyper Mode to be too broken to enjoy, but that's not quite the case for me. Maybe in a couple of areas, but not often. Prime 3 is also one of the best looking games to be found on the Wii, definitely better than Prime 2. However, since some of the environments can look a bit bland at times, I can't help but prefer the way Prime 1 was visualized. Thankfully, some of the music is still pretty good. Not exactly catchy or memorable, but undoubtedly more atmospheric than Echo's music. This is mainly for the pieces outside of the boss fights, because I particularly enjoy some of the boss themes in this game, with the battle against Dark Samus being a favorite of mine. Prime 3 is also the most cinematic and has the most story of the Prime games, thanks to the new voice acting and abundance of cutscenes and dialogue, so if that's your sort of thing, then this could be for you. The acting itself isn't spectacular by any means, but I suppose it could have been worse. In spite of that, at this day and age, I now find it a tad bit odd that Samus still doesn't speak while most of the other characters do. Don't judge on that statement too much though, because again, we're not at that game yet. In conclusion, while I admire the setup of Prime 1 over all the other Prime games, Corruption is definitely a good place to start if you've yet to play any of the Prime games, or any of the Metroid games in general. It's been a long time now since we've had to continue on from here, but let's hope that we'll be seeing more Prime games in the future. Hold on a sec though, because we're not quite done yet. In 2009, 2 years after the Prime series had concluded, we were presented with a complete package of all 3 games on the Wii called Metroid Prime Trilogy, with some added features. Prime 3 is pretty much the same as it was, but Prime 1 and 2 have both been given motion control so that it feels more natural like in Prime 3. And in addition to that, they've also been given widescreen support, so you no longer have to deal with a 4:3 ratio. Apparently there's also a bit of added bloom here and there in Prime 1, but I haven't noticed it. The only problem I have with the controls is switching between beam weapons, because you have to hold down the plus button and move the cursor to which beam you want to use. It kinda breaks the flow a little, but it's nothing to worry about too much. Still though, I don't see why we couldn't have just used the D-pad on the Wiimote. The difficulty for Prime 2 has also been slightly toned down, so that should hopefully make some of the bosses a little easier to handle. And finally, the credit system from Prime 3 is back and is another addition to Prime 1 and 2, and now includes artwork and playable music from both games. I'm very glad that I can play Prime 1 with a fusion suit this time without having to buy a link cable for the GameCube and Game Boy Advance. This is an excellent package that every Metroid fan should have in their collection. Sadly, it didn't take too long for it to be discontinued, and as a result, it can fetch for some pretty high prices on eBay. Luckily, Nintendo has just re-released the Prime Trilogy as a digital title on the Wii U's eShop. And of course I was one of the people that went for the launch offer of £9. That was a bargain I simply couldn't refuse. But even at its full price of £18, that's still a hell of a deal compared to getting a physical copy. I suggest that you get this as fast as you can in case Nintendo decides to jack up the price at any point. It's well worth the money and a great way for those who are just getting into the series. Well everybody, that just leaves 2 spin-offs and 1 certain other title before we finish looking over every single Metroid game in existence. But we're not going to be covering them in the next video. We'll save those for later, as it is now time to do another marathon. I know it's pretty early after only 2 individual reviews, but I figured that it's best to get this one out of the way before I do future planned marathons further down the road. Hope you guys look forward to it, and I will see you in the next video.